Welcome to LLT 121 Classical Mythology. I'm your instructor, Dr. Joseph Hughes, Associate Professor of Modern and Classical Languages at Southwest Missouri State University. This is the telecourse version of LLT 121, which means that the class is going to be primarily lecture format, and such time as you can contact me, I'll be happy to interact with you. But our primary vehicle of instruction this semester is going to be the course lectures, which are available from Continuing Ed, and also the text by Morford and Lenardin. The class format is basically my giving lectures on the assigned portions of the book. Unfortunately, I won't be able to answer your questions immediately, but the contact information, that is to say my telephone number, my office number, and my office hours and email address will be available to you both in the syllabus and in the course study guide, which you will be able to get at the SMSU bookstore. As a general rule, I'd like to think I'm pretty good about letting my students know what I expect of them. If you see me, some helpful study tips include if you see me talking about something over and over again, if you see me repeating a buzzword over and over again, the chances are very good that it's going to be on the test somewhere or another. The same thing if I take the trouble to write a term or some information up on the blackboard. If I take time to write something up on the blackboard, it means it's something I feel is pretty important. If I write something neatly on the blackboard, that means I must really consider it very important. Also very helpful, you will find the study guide very helpful. You will find the questions of the people in the class very helpful, actually. And again, if you have any more questions about the course material, about the lectures, I'm always on campus. I'm always available at my office telephone number or my email. Just an aside about the format of the lectures and the structure of the tests. There will be several quizzes during the semester and two final examinations. This will be two examinations. This will be specified in the syllabus. The examinations will be multiple choice, matching, short answer, and whatnot. There will also be essay questions. You will not have to guess what the essay questions are. I will give you an idea of what's going to be on the essay questions. Most of us, if not all of us, have had at one point or another in our life some professor whose purpose in life was to make the students look ignorant and insignificant and what have you. My other shortcomings aside, I'm not that type. The purpose of my exams is for you to show me that you're interested in this stuff, that you've been studying it, that you appreciate it, that you're motivated, and most importantly, that you're well taught. With that said, I'd like to make a few remarks about the structure of the course itself. You'll notice that the title of the class is Classical Mythology. I'll speak to this topic at a little bit more length in the first lecture, but I feel I should warn you right now that as skeptical children of the 20th century, soon to be the 21st century, you would expect a college course to be able to provide you with a rational, cohesive overview of a given topic, much as elementary biology will tell you about the study of life forms, as geology will tell you about the study of the earth. Mythology is formed from two Greek words, mythos, which is a story that basically you tell while you're waiting in line or sitting on a bus or something like that, and logos, rational account. The myths and legends we encounter in LLT 121 Classical Mythology are basically stories that ancient dead Greeks and Romans told for various reasons, but they told them in the first place because they were interesting and entertaining, not to explain their religious beliefs, not to explain their social practices, not to explain their idea of what made good literature or bad literature. Stories that they told to each other while they were sitting around the campfire and whatnot. From these stories, we can deduce, we can arrive at conclusions about who these people were, these ancient Greeks and Romans who told us these stories. We'll be able to find out what their social values were, what their religious beliefs were, or we'll get some pretty good ideas at any rate. Gender roles, it's all in there. But please keep in mind that these are just stories that are told to entertain, amuse, and only incidentally explain things. And that, as such, we can't really expect coherency and consistency from them. If I can give you just one example, the ancient Greeks believed that the goddess Aphrodite was born from the splashing down of the severed genitalia of the sky god Uranus. The ancient Greeks also believed that the goddess Aphrodite was the daughter of Zeus, the grandson of Uranus, and his wife Dione. Obviously, to the 20th century mindset, these cannot be true. They are mutually exclusive, but not to the ancient Greeks. The ancient Greek tendency, the ancient Roman tendency, is to reconcile these things. And I can predict confidently that it will probably, at some point or another, drive you crazy. But it's part of the territory. Please bear with me. I'd like to close with just a few remarks on the question, why study classical mythology? Why study the marginally incoherent tales of some people who have been dead for going on 3,000 years now? What does this have to do with me? I have a lot of reasons. You'll be subjected to them over the balance of the semester. But the image I keep coming back to, if you can imagine, you've all applied to Southwest Missouri State University. You have all gotten paperwork from Southwest Missouri State University. You can all probably by now close your eyes and see the official logo of Southwest Missouri State University, which is the portico, the front porch, if you will, of Carrington Hall. Carrington Hall was built in the first decade of the 1900s, I believe 1905. And the design is a quote-unquote classical design. A classical design that was decided on, that was put together because it emulated other classical buildings in the United States. These buildings in the United States were quote-unquote classically designed because many European buildings were quote-unquote classically designed. The porch, the triangular pediment, the columns, the steps leading up. For whatever reason, and we will get into this too, I think, for whatever reason, the ideals, the artistic forms, and the stories of the ancient Greeks and Romans have inspired, have motivated, have influenced the art, the literature, political thoughts, social values of people in Europe and actually around the world. That's not to say that we have to like the ancient Greeks and Romans. We don't have to. It's not to say we have to model our own values, our own beliefs, our own art upon the art and literature and values of the ancient Greeks and Romans, because we don't have to. But for better or worse, the stories we're going to study this semester are stories passed on by people who are, in effect, our cultural great-great-great-great-grandparents. And to me, this is the most valuable thing of all about studying classical mythology, about studying the ancient world. We get an opportunity to look back across the years at the peoples whose civilizations built our own. And I think that when we look across the years, we catch them telling stories about gods and goddesses and heroes and whatnot, the reason why things came to be. We meet these people, we look at these people, and we see ourselves. I hope that you enjoyed classical mythology this semester. I hope that you learn a lot, and I look forward to seeing you in our next class. Thank you. Some of you, as I'm going to find out, no doubt, already have a strong interest in classical mythology, in the civilizations of the ancient Romans and ancient Greeks, and the rest of you will get one very soon. It does have what I would consider, at least, a good deal of inherent interest. I've been interested in ancient Romans and ancient Greeks since I was in junior high school. The ancients, as we're going to find out, had a lot of strange ideas about how the world works, about the way that people ought to live their lives, and such like. I can guarantee that there will be times when you reel back in your seats just wrapping yourself upside the head and laughing at the idea that serious people could actually believe some of the things we're going to be talking about in this class. On the other hand, sometimes these ancient Romans and ancient Greeks were miles ahead of us in what they believed. Sometimes their outlook on life was something we could still learn from today. For all of the toga parties and all of the incidences of Zeus getting some other poor mortal woman pregnant, what we're dealing with here is our own intellectual ancestry. For better or for worse, the Greeks influenced the Romans. The Romans influenced just about everybody in the Mediterranean world. And just about everybody in the Mediterranean world influenced us. Even today, many traces of Greco-Roman civilization exist. Have any of you taken Western Civ yet? Did you enjoy it? Your name is? Greer. Did you enjoy it? I liked it, but I'm kind of strange. It's all full of czars and kaisers and Holy Roman emperors. These people are basically trying to say we are the continuation of the Roman Empire. Why? We'll get to that. The Romans were ruled by a group of people called a Senate. The Senate in ancient Rome was a bunch of rich, old, white guys from good families. What do we have today? And who's in it? When you take a walk around campus and you look at Carrington Hall, what you will see, I think, I've seen this thing on letterhead 50 gajillion times. Does Carrington Hall have pillars in front of it? Okay, good. What you're seeing is an architect. It's horrible, I know, but if you can draw better, what's your name? Michael. Got you, Michael. If you can draw better, come on up. What you're seeing is an architectural style that the Romans borrowed from the Greeks and replicated all over the Mediterranean world, and God knows where the Greeks stole it from. We're not going to cover that very much. We're going to meet the people that produced this architecture. We're going to meet the people that produced this political culture. And that, to me, is the real joy of studying about the ancient world, and that, to me, is the real joy of studying classical mythology. Our sources on Greek and Roman mythology, it says here, are depressingly scanty. Much of what interests us today about ancient civilizations did not interest the people who wrote ancient history back then. Back then, Roman history,
was written by rich Roman men. It was about rich Roman men and what they were interested in. The women were too busy having children. The slaves were too busy being slaves. The poor people were too busy being poor. The same goes for the ancient Greeks. However, we do have archaeological information. We do have coinage that we have dug up. We do have paintings. And best of all, to me, and I've read the histories, I've looked at the paintings, the best indicator to me of where these people were really at, who these people really were, is the stories they told to explain or to try to explain the world about them, so-called classical mythology. I wish I could say that we possess all of the stories in classical mythology in a convenient pre-packaged form that is completely sensible and hangs together like our new public affairs building will. Oops. However, there are variations on the stories that grow up side by side. Those of you who have siblings, brothers or sisters, will get together maybe when you're 30 or 40 and talk about what it was like when you were young. It turns out that my brother was dragged out and beaten every day because my parents were really strict, whereas I thought they were always really nice and forbearing to me. My mom, my dad. The point is that we're going to get version A, version B, version C, version D of some of these stories. And you're going to want to jump out of your seats and say, wait a minute, that's not the way I heard it. And I'm going to be forced to reply to you, stop being a skeptical child of the 21st century or 20th century, because there are two different versions of many of the same stories. To give you one example, the goddess Aphrodite was born when the severed genitalia of the god Uranus dropped down and hit the ocean. Your name is? What do you think of that story, Mark? Be honest with me. Be brutally honest.
I think it sounds rather far-fetched.
You're trying to tell me it sucks, right? Okay. It is rather silly. In its own context, it makes sense. How about if I were to tell you that the goddess Aphrodite was actually the daughter of Zeus and his wife Dione? Well, that's more like it. I mean, the child of a man and a woman, or a god and a goddess. But to the ancient Greeks, each of these explanations is equally valid. I know what you're thinking, Jennifer. If you've got two people in this room who say, I am Napoleon Bonaparte, what do you know for a fact? Well, at least one of them is lying. It can't be A equals A and B equals A. It's one or the other. Park that at the door, folks. Another thing is that sometimes the story gives out. It fills your mind with details that make no difference whatsoever to you, but the really interesting parts are lost. All we can do in these cases is make guesses. I love making guesses. Your guesses will be welcome too. I don't have a horrible lot of certainty about the things we're going to cover in this class, but don't worry, I think it's going to work anyway. Finally, my final pleas to you people. It says here, suspend your 20th century disbelief. We have indeed advanced a long time, a great deal since the times of the ancient Romans and ancient Greeks. But at the same time, the one thing I can guarantee to you about the year 2525, if we're all still alive, is that we'll look back at what people believed in the year 1996 and laugh. We think we're so advanced. We think we have civilization down. The people in the year 2525 are going to look at us like a bunch of buffoons. So please, let's not do this to the ancient Greeks and ancient Romans. A certain amount of giggling cannot be helped. But don't laugh, because the same thing will happen to our civilization with time. Number two is I'd like you to show some imagination. If you will, try to imagine yourself in the year 1400 BC. No lights, no food, no motor cars, no books, no fancy clothes, no overhead lighting. And some of the explanations you're going to hear about things are going to make a lot more sense. And finally, number three, try to enjoy yourselves. The reading is sometimes long. It's usually long. Sometimes the lectures are interminable. But, for better or worse, these stories are the best part of what remains of our cultural ancestors in the ancient Romans and ancient Greeks. And God knows it's not going to make you rich to master this stuff. But I think you'll come to see, as I do, that it has a good deal of inherent worth and a good deal to say about how we live our lives. Woo. Any questions on that up to this point? Anybody have any questions for me? Have I talked too fast? Have I missed anything that needs to be covered? Okay, people who mess with their hair are in trouble. I envy people who have hair. What is classical mythology? If I could share just a little anecdote about myself with you, a very brief one. When I first taught classical mythology here many years ago, I didn't even think to answer this question. I didn't think to ask this question. This is classical mythology, darn it. And that's what you're here for. So tough. But then I started wondering, what is classical? What is mythology? I have 2 degrees in classics. And there was a time when, what are the classics? I couldn't answer right off the top of my head. I felt ashamed. And what is mythology, anyway? Let's start with mythology. What is mythology? Mythology is an ancient Greek word built on the Greek word mythos. You know, I don't make an awful lot of money to do this, but there are the satisfactions of the job. Listening to a whole class go for the backpacks, pull out the pencils, just gives me a special feeling inside. It comes from the Greek word mythos and the equally Greek word logos. To start out with mythos, or myth, it simply means a story that is passed on by word of mouth. I know what you're going to say. Today, a myth means something that is not true. When I tell you Elvis is still alive, Elvis is still the king, you could jump up and say that's a myth. And you would probably mean that's hooey. That's false. But to the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, myth just meant a story that was passed along by word of mouth. The stories that you might have heard, for example, about your great-grandparents or your grandparents. I know a few stories about my grandparents that were passed down by word of mouth. I have no reason to believe they're not true. But these fall in the category of myths, something passed along orally. For example, how many of you are familiar with the story of the 3 little pigs? Is there anybody who is not familiar with the story? How many of you first encountered that story when you read it? Makes my point. How many of you know the story of George Washington and the cherry tree? What was that one all about? Your name is?
Phil.
Phil?
George Washington handed down an apple tree.
George Washington chopped down the apple tree and his dad, or the cherry tree, or the palmetto tree, and his dad said, George, did you chop down that tree? And he says, I cannot tell a lie, I chopped it down. That was passed along by word of mouth. It never happened. There's an example of a myth that was made up. But I ask you to park at the door your conception that a myth in and of itself is necessarily untrue. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. It's more often the traditional shaggy dog story. You know, my mythology professor was telling me today some of the things I say are true, and sometimes I have to admit I'm going to make things up just to see if you believe them, just to see if you're paying attention to me. But if it's passed along by word of mouth, it is a myth. The word logos, on the other hand, means a rational account. For those of you who read ancient Greek, the beginning of the Gospel of John, in the beginning there was the Word. Okay? The Greek word that John uses for the Word with a capital W is logos. What it is expression plus reasoning. Expression for a purpose. Over here, a mythos is a story I can tell you to teach you a lesson, or it's a story I can tell you to amuse you. It's something that can be true. It's something that can be false or kind of in between. Whereas logos is always true. Logos is told for a purpose. Logos is right. And that's why, for instance, we have, in addition to mythology, we have geology, biology, anthropology, psychology, and 57 other ologies, all of which you can take for general education credits. Biology is the study of life forms. Geology, study of the earth. Not that let's sit around and talk about the earth, but to try to understand the earth for what it is, to try to understand life forms for what they are. That's ology. And that's mythology, the orderly, reasoned study of a bunch of stories that people told each other to shock, amuse, and entertain and inform each other. There is a basic contradiction here, isn't there? To try to bring order to the myths of the ancient Greeks and ancient Romans is kind of like maybe herding cats or something, trying to catch the wind. But for better or worse, that's what we're going to try to do. I just hope that you don't hold me responsible for the loose ends. And what is a classic? This is the part that I really didn't think needed to be justified. I have 2 degrees in classics, the study of ancient Greek and Latin literature and language. Somebody once asked me, what do you teach? And I said, the classics. He smiled and said, classical what? Classical Hindu? Classical Chinese? Classical Vietnamese? Classical Maya? I thought he was being a wise guy, but he had a very good point. Classical is not strictly restricted to the ancient Greek and ancient Roman civilizations. A classical anything can occur in any civilization. Very briefly, to me, a classic is something, and you don't have to write this down. This is just a working definition. We'll probably change it later on. I always do. Does anybody have an idea of a classic car in their mind? What's a classic car? Okay, 57 Chevy. Why is a 57 Chevy a classic? Because it's old, okay? Because it has a look to it that has not gone out of style. You wish they made cars that were still that good looking. And we all have, there's even songs about 57 Chevys now. It's part of our cultural fiber. Any of you remember a time when the Coca-Cola company decided that they would make their product taste more like Pepsi? Do you remember that? Your name is? Regina, do you remember that? And they called it New Coke, right? Did you try any of it? Not to offend anybody's sponsors here, but it tasted like Pepsi. Which is fine, but if you want to drink Pepsi, you buy Pepsi. And when the bottlers of Coca-Cola recognized what a mistake they had made, they brought back the old formula, but they didn't call it the same old Coke we used to sell. They called it Coke Classic, which not only implies it's the same old Coke, but it's the same old Coke that Americans have loved. That it's the same old Coke that's a part of American life. And that as a classic Coke, it exists on a level where Pepsi doesn't dare come after it. I actually prefer to drink Pepsi. But for what it's worth, the word classic bailed them out of a big jam because it suggests old, important, something that is striven for and almost never reached. Another thing is the classical rock and roll. Do we have a classical rock and roll station in this town? More or less. They play songs that are old. Are all of them good? Yes? No? No, some of them are, these classical songs are pretty bad, as a matter of fact. Are you familiar with a band called Styx? I was in high school when they made albums. They were bad then. They are bad now. But they count as a classic. I hope I haven't offended anybody. If I have, it's too bad. I'm a very tolerant, caring, loving person in everything except for taste in music. There, I'm right and you're wrong. A lot of the stuff in classical mythology, a lot of the stuff in classical civilization is like the old rock band Styx. It stunk even then. There's no telling why it survived, but it did. Not all classics are profound or good or realistic. But for better or worse, it's wrapped up in our cultural fiber. In short, a classic is something from a bygone era that for whatever reason is wrapped up in our culture too. We can't help it. It's used as a yardstick to measure present-day experience, and it has lasting value, appeal, and validity. It may or may not be Greek or Roman. What I'd like to do just for the last couple minutes is to go over just a little bit of the three definitions. How about that? 3 definitions. By the way, when I write something on the board, that means it's a very good chance that it might appear on a test or a quiz someday. And if I write it neatly, that means it's even more likely. True myth. True myth is one of 3 categories of traditional stories. The other ones are legend, and folk tale. Okay. A true myth is simply a story passed along by word of mouth which is believed to be true by its society. It usually takes place in one primordial time, primordial just simply means when the earth was young, before they even started counting time. You don't read about true myths happening last week. The characters in a true myth are usually supernatural. By which I mean gods, goddesses, monsters, and the like. You don't meet Bob, the clerk at Get and Go, in a quote-unquote true myth. And finally, a true myth usually, but not always, has an etiological function. And here's what I mean by etiological. A-E-T-I-O-L-O-G-I-C-A-L. An etiological story just explains why something is the way it is. Why is the sky blue? Because God decided to paint it blue. That's an etiology. A true myth is usually, but not always, an attempt to explain why something is the way it is. Let me give you just one example of a quote-unquote true myth. You may know this one. The god Hades, god of the underworld, was having a tough time finding a wife. Once the nubile young goddesses would find out what he did for a living, being king of the underworld, it was kind of tough to get a second date. And so he went to his brother Zeus, who is the #1 god of the ancient Greek universe, and said, "Can I take your daughter Persephone?" We'll get back to this story later. And Zeus says, "Yeah, okay." Didn't ask Persephone. Didn't ask Persephone's mom. So one day, as young Persephone, this lovely young lady goddess, was strolling through a field picking flowers, Hades, god of the underworld, came roaring up on his chariot, dragged her into the chariot, and dragged her down to the underworld to be his wife. To make a long story short for right now, Persephone wasn't happy to be in the underworld as Mrs. Hades. Persephone's mom, the grain goddess Demeter, was not happy about this arrangement either. And since Demeter was the goddess of grain, she decided to hold off all of the grain growing until she got her daughter back. Unfortunately, while Persephone was in the underworld, she had eaten of the fruit of the pomegranate, which means that she had to spend forever after 6 months down in the underworld and 6 months on Mount Olympus with her mom. And this, primordial time, supernatural characters, etiological function, because it explains to the ancient Greeks the seasons. When when Persephone is in the underworld, Demeter, her mother, is not happy. She will not allow the grain to grow. That's winter. When Persephone is back with her mother, Demeter is happy. She allows the grain to grow. That's spring and summer, and such like. Category number 2 is legend or saga. Number 1, legend or saga usually takes place in historical time. That is to say, we can usually slap a year on it. Number 2, it has heroic characters. And number 3, its function is usually historical. Let me just give you one example. Right around 1200 BC, 1200 AD, in Britain, there was a highwayman who was named Robert of Locksley. His job was to rob people he ran into on the highway, take all their goodies away from them, and maybe let them live if he was having a good day. He was a real dude. Over the years, people started passing around stories about Robert of Locksley. By the time you probably heard about Robert of Locksley for the first time, he lived in merry old England, and he was heroic. Why? He was Robin Hood, darn it, and he stole from the rich and gave to the poor. And his historical function is, let us all remember the great heroes who have worked hard to make things nicer for poor people like us. When in fact he was just a robbing, murdering thug. Sometimes a legend takes on proportions greater than its subject deserves. But that happens. And finally, and this is where we're going to begin in our next exciting class, we're going to talk about folk tales and fables. I have a really good example of a folk tale or fable that I can tell you about on Wednesday, but we don't have time for it here. Suffice it to say that folk tales tend to happen in once upon a time, that they have anti-heroic characters, pigs, cyclopses, stuff like that. And finally, they have, how do I say this, educational function. But we'll get to that in our next exciting class.